Now, this is something that you guys don't want to hear from me. I don't know how I became the resident Luffy hater, but I think I'm the Luffy realist. But there's something that we got to talk about here. The Luffy disrespect. I'm not sure if I necessarily feel this way, that Luffy's been disrespected, but I understand why people would have this perspective. It's interesting because when you think of Luffy disrespect, I think the most recent thing that comes to memory is Sanji and everything that transpired in Whole Cake Island. I have my thoughts on that and where I stand in regards to Sanji disrespecting Luffy. And sometimes it may come across as a bit hypocritical because I remember the Usopp moment, right? In which Usopp and how he disrespected Luffy as far as challenging his position in regards to destroying the Merry and moving on. I didn't necessarily agree with Usopp, but I think Luffy should have handled it better. Something that always pissed me off back then was Sanji kicking Luffy when Luffy was about to tell Usopp that he doesn't really need him on the crew. But in Whole Cake Island, I understood what Sanji was trying to do and the pain that came from those kicks, so it's more so easy to give it a pass. I think both Usopp and Sanji disrespected Luffy. There's a lot of nuance in regards to why Usopp did it versus why Sanji did it. I think the person that was in more of a bind was definitely Sanji, but that's not to take away from Usopp's reason for doing it. The Merry is somebody he cared about, and he felt like by taking that stance, possibly the ship could be saved. So it was kind of selfish because we have to think of the Merry's connection to Kaya. However, everyone was connected to the Merry. And so therefore, it's a peculiar situation. But honestly, that's not the disrespect I'm talking about. The disrespect is more so towards Luffy's portrayal in the story and his matchups with different characters. Now, the Luffy disrespect that I'm talking about varies from arc to arc. For Wano in particular, this started way back in Luffy versus Kaido. For some of you may not remember, you may not notice, and this goes back to just how interactive I am, not only on Twitter, but also on YouTube and different forums. So I probably come into contact with more One Piece readers than the average person. I kind of gauge the consensus from that because I understand some people are like, well, no one ever says this. I'm like, well, you're probably not interacting with as many One Piece users or just people talking about One Piece as I am. And the consensus after Luffy was defeated by Kaido, that overwhelmingly was that that is not really indicative of Luffy's strength. Meaning, once Luffy and Kaido fights again, that wouldn't happen. And I agree with that, but not only for situational purposes, but also because Luffy has gotten stronger. Luffy was training in Udon, he learned some things from Hyogoro, so therefore the Luffy that fought Kaido is not the same Luffy that will fight Kaido in the future. So there are variables there that we have to consider. But recently, in chapter 980, the Luffy disrespect has reared its head once again. Whereas people feel like Luffy getting disrespected by Apu that way was BS. But before we talk about that moment specifically, let's go back a bit and just dissect the moments in which people felt like Luffy's been disrespected. And a huge part of this is where people scale Luffy in general, where I think a lot of people have Luffy on a pedestal or at a level that he's not at yet. What I mean is Gear 4th has created a veil of not invincibility, but somewhat overconfidence when that's not Luffy's true strength. What I mean is Gear 4th is severely flawed. And a lot of people scale Luffy based on his strongest form, Gear 4th. Whereas for Luffy at this point, he cannot maintain that form. So a lot of Luffy's battles where Gear 4th is involved, while it can be an advantage at times, it could also be a detriment. So for an individual, if you scale Luffy at Gear 4th level every time and you see certain things happening to him, you're going to think he's being disrespected. So post time skip, where did this all start? Well, I think the first time was probably Punk Hazard. Fishman Island, we all understand that Luffy was clearly the strongest person there. Some Zoro stans might disagree, but I digress. So everything that happened there was pretty much a showcase. Punk Hazard is a bit more unique because Luffy actually lost to opponents he was clearly superior to. One being Caesar, the other being Monet. For Caesar, he has an amazing Devil Fruit in which if you use it correctly, it could overpower anyone. However, for Luffy, the issue is that Luffy is just coming off of the time skip. Luffy should be several levels above this person. This person isn't even really a combatant. How is this happening? How can Luffy get overwhelmed or caught off guard or taken aback by someone like Caesar? And I think this is painting like a picture of the One Piece world and just how unique Devil Fruits are. And I think that continued in Punk Hazard, which is something I'll probably talk about, like the theme of Punk Hazard, where it's some perception versus reality. But I think also in Punk Hazard, it's a lot of things aren't always what they seem. But regardless, Luffy losing to these individuals shouldn't have happened in a lot of people's eyes. Personally, you can understand why it happened. bones. And it was reiterated in Punk Hazard when Zoro told Luffy, hey, this is the new world. We have to start taking things seriously. We cannot continue to take things for granted and be as happy-go-lucky as we usually are. A lot of people love this moment, but for some, they felt like it exposed a blatant flaw in Luffy's character. Whereas I don't know if it's a flaw, but it's something that he probably should have taken notice to. So with that, was Luffy disrespected because he lost to people that were weaker than him? No, I think this is exposing the type of person Luffy is. Whereas from time to time, either through tactics or just Luffy warming up, he can get overwhelmed early. That happens to him over and over again. Like Luffy loses the initial matchup, then he comes back and then he does his thing. Let's go to Dressrosa, where some people felt like disrespect happened as well. And this is versus Doflamingo, obviously. Luffy did not use Gear 4th for most of that arc. But again, we should not judge Luffy based off of just Gear 4th because Gear 4th has a huge drawback. But some people were taken aback by the Chinjiao fight because they felt like Luffy should have won even easier. Where I'm like, you don't understand the legend that is Chinjiao. And I think Chinjiao has gotten even more hype based on information that's been revealed about Garp. Whereas him and Garp, and I think it was clear that they fought several times and Garp didn't take him down until like that last and final time. So for Chinjiao fighting the greatest and a lot of people feel like the strongest Marine ever, him fighting Luffy for that long, why is that really an issue? Luffy versus Doflamingo. A lot of people wanted a one-on-one fight. And some people feel like even if Law wasn't there, Luffy would win. But Oda likes nuance. In a lot of his fights, he introduces nuance because I think he wants to go the route of matchup-based things, whereas the matchup and situation is important to beat someone, and Whole Cake Island kind of showed that, whereas personality was involved, definitely matchups, and showing that Luffy, based on his personality, will always figure out a way to come out on top. And that takes us back to Wano. Like I stated before, Luffy will never get one shot again, especially by Kaido. Taking out his growth and how strong he got in Udon and learning different techniques, Luffy was not calm. Observation Haki was not being used. And honestly, while being calm makes sense to use Observation Haki, it's always going to be an excuse in the series. When somebody gets hit by something, oh, they were flustered. So for Luffy and Kaido, that situation in particular is understandable. Luffy thought his crew had just died. So for him raging and going on like that, Kaido took advantage of it. Even though Kaido was just overwhelmingly stronger, he still took advantage. I'm not going to mention the anime and Luffy versus Batman because the anime sometimes it takes certain liberties, and I say this all the time, you gotta be mindful of how the anime does things, right? So Luffy versus Batman, let's just try to ignore that. But Apu versus Zoro and Luffy, we have to consider Apu's powers. Apu is using sound waves, and at some point we'll talk about Luffy Future Sight, whether he has it or not. But at that point, several other people were around Luffy. Apu is using sound waves, and that moment is for a purpose. It was literally just to hype Kid. So Apu doing that, I don't see the big deal. I think it gets weird and blasphemous when people start saying that Katakuri probably doesn't hit as hard as Apu because Katakuri never stunned Luffy like that. And I think Oda in particular, it's not necessarily about power scaling, right? It's about moments for him. So for him, having Apu do that to Zoro and Luffy, it laid it out for Kid to come in and have his moment. So power scaling wise, while you may think it doesn't make any sense, the situation I think makes sense. Apu struck from a distance. He's done this before to people stronger than Luffy and Zoro. So is it really disrespect? Granted, Luffy is extremely powerful at this point. Most people think only Big Mom and Kaido are threats to Luffy at this point. I don't think so. I think Queen and King are threats as well, even Smoothie, because while Luffy did win against Katakuri, he didn't beat him, and that was an extreme situation. Yes, he's gotten a bit stronger. However, fighting a commander is going to be difficult regardless. Luffy's just not at the level yet where he can just brush a commander aside. Maybe he has his Blue Note moment versus a commander in this arc, but for right now, based on what we've seen from Luffy, he has to take everyone seriously, especially a supernova who has been hyped from pre-time skip. So for them, I think it's partially not only to hype them and show that they're part of the worst generation as well, but also a reminder for the Straw Hats, in particular Luffy, that maybe you should change the way you do things. And maybe that's a conversation for another day. Luffy developing not only as a combatant, but as a character. Because people had issues with that as well in chapter 980. So I understand not knowing someone's devil fruit power and getting caught off guard, but is that really an excuse? How much longer can we accept that? How often are you going to know someone's devil fruit power? That in itself is part of strategy. Maybe we need to progress a little bit. So again, I understand Luffy does get disrespected sometimes, but not by the story, just by how people scale him and the people they feel like could be stronger or weaker or whatever. But in this instance, there's no disrespect. It's a situation, it's a matchup, it's the unknown. So for Luffy, this is something you learn from, but this has always been the case. So I'm not sure why people are surprised. We know he'll bounce back. And not only Luffy, but also Zoro. But guys, give me your thoughts. What did you think about this Luffy disrespect? Do you think it was Luffy disrespect? I think giving Luffy a 1.5 billion berry bounty is respect in its own right. But for us, following the story and the different nuances we see from time to time is going to get overblown. But all in all, Luffy's not disrespected. He's just careless sometimes. But yeah, give me your thoughts. Make sure to like the video if you did. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Follow me on twitch.tv/BragoDAce. Thank you guys so much for your support. Like and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.